Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 55. This month we're looking at a story that was for a long time not included in the works of Conan Doyle, 1884's The Bloodstone Tragedy, a Druidical Story. And here's Paul to introduce the tale.
Whilst travelling in the English Midlands, the narrator hears a strange tale from a fellow traveller, whose wife, in their pre-marital days, underwent a terrifying experience during a family holiday in North Wales. Frustrated by the domestic restrictions imposed upon her, while the men of the party enjoy climbing expeditions, the intrepid Miss Madison decides to indulge in some local exploration on her own. She eventually becomes lost amongst the mountains and the valleys, and is close to despair, when she discovers a primitive hut and its odd inhabitant, a wild and bearded figure dressed in a white robe. But her relief at finding a potential guide soon turns to unease, as her new acquaintance begins to talk of strange gods and human sacrifice.
Now, we have a very good idea of the writing of this story because it is heavily based on a real-life incident. In mid-January 1884, newspaper reports began to circulate of a peculiar incident in Llantrisant in the Vale of Glamorgan in Wales. It surrounded the story of a self-professed Druid, Dr. William Price of Pontypridd, who was caught in the act of cremating his recently deceased son, cremation not being permitted at the time. Now, Price is quite an interesting character, and we're going to come back to him in a moment, but for now, it's enough to say that these newspaper reports were expanded upon and widely circulated throughout January and into February, and they clearly fueled Conan Doyle's imagination, because within a few weeks, he'd penned this short story and sent it to Castle's Saturday Journal, who printed it in their 16th of February edition, 1884. All of which means that the Bloodstone Tragedy has what's probably the shortest gestation period of any Conan Doyle story that we know of. But the publication of the story is only half the tale, because the Bloodstone Tragedy was for a very long time not known to be a Conan Doyle story. In keeping with many contemporary journals, Castle's published the story anonymously. And even though they went on to print 3 more Conan Doyle stories, John Barrington Cowell's The Cabman's Story and The Lonely Hampshire Cottage, when it came to writing the official history of Castle's as a publisher, they didn't record that the Bloodstone Tragedy was from the pen of Conan Doyle. In fact, we only came to know that Conan Doyle was the author in the mid-80s, really, when the papers from the Castle's archive were sold at auction, and one collector, Mike Halewood, who's a bookseller based in Preston in Lancashire, bought 2 letters from Conan Doyle. One of them, dated November 1885, was a request to Castle's for the right to reprint 2 of his stories, John Barrington Cowell's and what he called The Bloodstone, in a collection he was planning called Light and Shade. Light and Shade ultimately wasn't published, but he did create an anthology, The Captain of the Pole Star and Other Stories, which came out by Longmans in 1890, although that volume didn't include the Bloodstone Tragedy. In the mid-1990s, Mike Halewood contacted the Arthur Conan Doyle Society, the forerunner of today's ACD Society, with the suggestion that they publish this lost work, which they did in 1995 with an introduction by Christopher and Barbara Roden and an extensive afterword by Owen Dudley Edwards. And as a result, the story was restored to us and recognised as an early work by Conan Doyle. The lack of attribution is an important detail in this story, because in an era before copyright, it could easily result in others taking the credit. And while we've been looking into the background of this story, we found a version of it printed in the Saturday Evening Post in Philadelphia on the 14th of June, 1884, simply as the Bloodstone, but credited to one M.W. Paxton, who was almost certainly the publisher and editor of the Rockbridge News in Lexington, Virginia, who clearly took advantage of the opportunity to reprint a work that was before copyright and put it into circulation in some of the American papers. And I mentioned there at the top that this story is based on this real-life incident of Dr. William Price, and he's one of those kind of bizarre figures that you get in the 19th century, that no matter how much you read into him, you always find something a little bit more crazy to top it. He was born in 1800 in Glamorganshire, son of a Church of England clergyman, and eventually went into medicine, actually studied at Barts, and became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, but in the 1820s moved back to Wales, served as a medical assistant in the ironworks, and he seems to there have fused an interest in neo-Druidism, this real interest in the revival of the Druids within Welsh culture, and a parallel interest in Chartism, or what would become Chartism, the sort of popular protest for men to get the vote, which became increasingly violent. And this all came to a head in 1839 with the Chartist uprising in Newport, where the Chartists had managed to get hold of field artillery and were eventually suppressed by the British Army. There were some quite bloody reprisals from that. Price didn't take part, but he is credited with actually providing the field artillery. And he had to very quickly escape to France, disguised as a washerwoman. But when he was in France, he was in Paris, went to the Louvre quite a bit, and he at that point discovered a stone with a Greek inscription, which he claimed was a message from an arch-druid some 2,000 years earlier that was crediting William Price in a pivotal role in restoring Druidism and indeed achieving Welsh independence. And so he returned to Wales, threw himself into Druidism, in fact claimed to be the arch-druid, and from that point became this kind of local celebrity of sort. In fact, he settled in the 1860s in Llantrisant, which is where the pivotal story takes place. And but he was known for traveling around to London and back in various peculiar items of dress. But the key thing that he's remembered for, and the thing that's pivotal for this story, is that in 1883, at the grand old age of 82 or 83, he got his 18-year-old servant pregnant, and they had a child which he named Jesus Christ. So we're not exactly traveling the roads of sanity here. But sadly, the child only survived 5 months, and he decided he was going to cremate the body on a hilltop. The flames went up. He was spotted by the locals, who then went to investigate, believed he was actually killing his child, and he narrowly escaped a lynching at the hands of the local mob. And that led to a kind of celebrated trial. But essentially, the point at which Conan Doyle comes into this story, or at least he's reading these narratives, is the point at which the incident on the hilltop in Llantrisant has been reported in the news, and it became a really celebrated criminal trial and something that occupied the popular imagination.
Yeah, it's an incident that really did grab hold nationally, and events moved pretty quickly as well, because the attempted cremation occurred on, it was Sunday 13th of January 1884. And there was all the trouble that you've described around it. And Price, at one point, he felt his life was threatened as the mob began to, as you say, they thought he'd killed the child, and their sensibilities were further offended by the fact that this was occurring on a Sunday.
Yes.
In Wales at that time, didn't go down well at all. So Price had to be protected by the police. He was quickly put up before the magistrates, and then the case was referred for trial at the Assizes in Cardiff on the 12th of February. And this was picked up pretty quickly by the national media, and Conan Doyle would have read of it in one of 5 publications. It's known to appear in the Standard, the Times, the Pall Mall Gazette, and that was all on the 15th of January. But it also appeared, details of it also appeared in the Lancet and the British Medical Journal. And Owen Dudley Edwards speculates that he thinks the BMJ would be the one where Conan Doyle would have picked up most of the detail. Once Price was put for the assizes in February, he had 5 charges put up against him, and this is as reported in the Standard. So 1, with attempting to dispose of the dead body of his male child, knowing that the coroner intended to hold an inquest upon it without notice to the coroner. 2, that he did on the 30th day of January unlawfully and indecently attempt to cremate the body of his infant, and that he offered indignities to the said body. 3, that by such conduct he caused a public nuisance. 4, that he did on the 16th instant, again seems to be the wrong date, by burning the said body, create such a stench as to be a public nuisance. 5, that he neglected to give Christian burial to the remains of the body. So those are the 5 charges he was facing, and it was the whole case was in the charge of famous judge Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, who was one of those Stephens. So he was Virginia Woolf's uncle, obviously related to Leslie Stephen, and James Fitzjames Stephen was also the father of James Kenneth Stephen, who was a famous alumnus of Cambridge University and was personal tutor at one point to the Duke of Clarence, Edward, the future Edward VII's son. And Stephen himself, the younger Stephen, had a pretty checkered career, and has latterly been accused of being Jack the Ripper and all sorts of.
As is everyone.
Yes, and interestingly, he was also a friend of the ghost story writer M.R. James at King's. But James, the son, had a horse, an accident riding at one point, which bashed his head, and he gradually seems to have gone mad through this, which is kind of, as we'll find out with this story, is a rather strange coincidence. And James Fitzjames Stephen, the judge himself, he later went mad. It was after he was the judge in charge of the murder trial of Florence Maybrick in Liverpool, and made some very peculiar judgments at that, after which his colleagues began to wonder about his abilities, and he was quietly retired. So yes, he was the man in charge of this case, the Price case, and he in this case caused problems from the start because he was on Price's side.
Yes,
essentially, and he wasn't convinced that Price had committed any offence, and James Fitzjames Stephen didn't want to be the judge who created a new offence.
Yeah.
So he kind of wanted to get this trial over as quickly as possible, and it didn't drag, but in the end, it was 2 juries had to be found, because I think the first jury could find Price innocent on 3 charges, weren't sure about the other 2, so a second jury was brought in, and in the end, ultimately, Price was acquitted of all charges, because there actually wasn't an offence of cremation in the way done. It wasn't against the law. It wasn't strictly legal, but it wasn't strictly illegal.
Yes.
Either. So essentially, the case came to nothing. And as is the way of things, and as is the way with fickle public opinion, he became a public hero after this. And ultimately, this also opened the way to cremation becoming openly legal. And, as we know by our own time, it is the way most people are dealt with after death rather than burial. So he is an important figure in that sense. And Doyle picked up on this and thought, aha, I see a story in this.
And the
Mm.
unusual thing in that is that, we know that he picked up on this story because it's directly cited right at the beginning, which in
Mm.
itself is quite unusual, I think, for to give a very explicit nod in that way to something quite that topical. And you were giving the dates there. I mean, if this story came out in mid-February, Conan Doyle probably only had the first couple of weeks of reporting to go on, and that's kind of Owen Dudley Edwards' point, really, isn't it?
Mm. Mm.
Where would he get the best material from?
And the fact that at the time this story was going to press, the trial, the Cardiff Assize trial, was actually underway.
Mm,
The fact that at the beginning of the story, Doyle does say, some unlucky impulse had led me to refer to Dr. Price and his recent attempt at the revival of Druidism by the cremation of an infant.
yes.
It's not strictly accurate.
No, not right. Not quite.
But it's one of these things. I mean, Doyle throughout his career really did have an eye for the main chance.
Yes.
And with this being in the air, it's a way of publicising his story.
Yeah,
Because
very much
people, oh,
so.
have you seen this story about? It would have attracted some attention.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. And would he have known then the name of the judge in question?
Well, I don't know at that point because obviously the trial was going on when it's going to press, but
Yeah.
it might have been announced, the trial will take place on such and such, and presiding judge will be Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, because there's an interesting kind of possible coincidence in the story in that Miss Madison, the heroine of the story,
Yeah.
has a brother called Stephen, and it's
Yes.
spelled Stephen, the same as
Yeah.
Fitzjames
Yeah.
Stephen. So it's possible that whether that again was deliberate or just a kind of subconscious accident.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting coincidence nonetheless.
Yes. And you're right about, Conan Doyle's keeping an eye on the main chance. I mean, it's such a lurid story. You can immediately see how it would fire his imagination, but it also fired the imagination of somebody else. Dylan Thomas wrote a short story in 1935 called The Burning Baby, which is quite one of the most unsettling and unpleasant short stories I think I've ever read. It's intensely disturbing, and it's about topics of incest and all manner, but it is directly credited with a conversation between Thomas and a friend about Dr. William Price. And so here we get another echo, another artist essentially drawing from the same source and producing something else, which in Dylan Thomas's story is quite astonishing. I mean, he was only 20 when he wrote it, but it's incredibly disturbing. It's quite
No.
shocking.
You can see that Thomas he's really close to the bone with
Oh gosh.
the story, and it's deep themes he's exploring, whereas Doyle is basically it's a piece of enjoyable melodramatic nonsense.
Yes.
Very over the top, and it is. I mean, the thing that's drawn both writers, you can see, is the symbolism of fire.
Yes.
And it's the fire, and I think from the way Doyle writes this story, it's the key thing is this huge fire that his druid is creating, which is very similar to the one that Price built, and it's what draws the attention
Yeah.
of viewers. It drew the townsfolk to investigate what was going on in Price's case, and in the Doyle story, it's the thing that enables the heroine to escape ultimately, because it's even though the incident is taking place in a hidden valley, there's this dirty great fire that kind of gives the game away.
Yeah, indeed.
Mm.
I think you said there about it being a bit of fluff, which I think is a perfectly apt description of it. This definitely has the feeling of a story that has been knocked off very quickly to capitalize on a moment. There are some interesting aspects to it. The form of narration is interesting, although Conan Doyle doesn't really do a huge amount about it. You mentioned there that, at the beginning, that the setup is that you have the narrator who is recounting a tale told to him by the husband of Miss Madison, who is essentially unconscious in the carriage at this point in time. So you get this strange nested narrative where you have the Miss Madison's story as told through her husband, as told through the narrator.
Mm.
And that strikes me as being something that could have been really interesting to experiment with, because you can have different perspectives and different interpretations of what's going on. But unfortunately, we don't really get any of that.
No, I mean you've got here. You could really play with the idea of the possibility of two unreliable narrators,
Exactly. Yeah.
and also the kind of the effect of one. The first narrator, the husband, wasn't there for most of the event,
Mm.
so he's getting the story secondhand from his wife, and then he's telling the story to the later narrator who has no connection to the incidents whatsoever.
Mm.
So he's supposed to be recording what the husband is saying. How much has he recorded correctly, and how much does he then embroider or embellish what he heard in the carriage? So it's there is a what could have been a fascinating play on stories here, and
Yes.
unfortunately, because this is something written at haste and written for a popular journal
Yeah.
rather than a more literary journal,
Yes.
those ideas aren't really picked up and played with.
Yeah. It's one of those ones where I think Conan Doyle might have thought better of it and come back to it again. But we'll come back to that later, because I think there are some elements in this that get repeated in other stories.
Mm.
The other thing I'd say about Miss Madison is that she's set up as being a very strong and interesting character. She's set up as being somebody she's headstrong, she's independent,
Mm.
she departs from this party of friends to go exploring, but then she loses all agency in the narrative, because ultimately she gets captured and then has to wait until she gets rescued. And that kind of lack of agency for her character is made even worse by the fact that she doesn't even have a voice in this story, not really,
Mm.
because
Mm.
actually her story is told by her husband. So I wonder if Conan Doyle was kind of uncertain about female narrators, because a couple of years before this we'd had The Winning Shot,
Mm.
which has female narrator, and I don't think he quite lands that. And he wouldn't be the first or the last to struggle with doing this. I mean, I was thinking about, I like the works of John le Carré, but there's no way he can write female narrators. He can barely write female characters.
Mm.
But I wonder if he kind of feels a bit unconfident on that platform, and that's why the narration is presented the way that it is.
Mm. And he's set the story up that she's going to be victim.
Yeah.
So there's also this the headstrong, the independent woman element, and then suddenly, but she's then got to become the classic
Yes,
Victorian heroine who has to be rescued by the men.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
so suddenly you've got a bit of a change in her character.
Yes, to make it
Whereas
work.
if she were really the character he describes at the beginning, she wouldn't just have placidly allowed herself to be tied up by this aged lunatic.
Yes, that's right. There is a sort of, I think, quite inadvertently funny bit, which is when the husband is narrating how Miss Madison decides she's going to buy herself time by asking this crazy druid to explain all about his beliefs and practices, etc. And then he says, poor girl, her mind was too full of horror to allow her to pay much attention to his disquisition. It's like, the whole idea was that she was just getting him to think about something else so she could try and escape. She wasn't meant to be paying attention to what his druidic folklore was meant to be and his mystic practices. But
It's wonderfully Victorian. With that,
yes,
with the kind of this is terribly interesting. What a pity she couldn't have listened a bit more. But, this ties into the sort of the readership who lapped up books by people like Sabine Baring-Gould.
yeah,
All these books of archaeology and here's some interesting facts about our ancestors
yes,
feeding that sort of audience and again, you wonder if this is Conan Doyle just with a wink to his readership, poking fun at that.
yeah,
It's the sort of thing he would have done.
yes, yeah, I think that's right.
Mm.
And while it's worth saying that, Conan Doyle based this story on the incident of William Price, he wasn't just drawing on that incident for his knowledge of Druidism. And it's worth saying a few things about how Druids and Druidism was popularly conceived by the time this story was written in the 1880s. There's very little known really about the Druids, other than the fact that they were peoples across northwest Europe sometime around 2,000 years ago. Ron Hutton has written an excellent book, Blood and Mistletoe, The History of the Druids in Britain, which came out in 2009. And he basically says there's very little that we can draw on directly as evidence to support much of what is said about Druids. He does come up with the interesting suggestion that Druid as a word comes from druidect, which actually means anyone who can practice magic, which means that Druids might have encompassed a whole range of people. In terms of sort of historical evidence, we only have really one first-hand account, and that's Julius Caesar, who encountered the Druids in the occupation of Gaul. And he essentially reflected the view that they were a priesthood, they were organized, they conducted human sacrifice, although that was less significant for the Romans then than we might think it now, because they'd only just got rid of human sacrifice themselves. And then you get a secondary source, which is Tacitus, who writes about the Romans suppressing the Druids in Britain in 57 AD. And this is the story of Suetonius Paulinus, the general who was based in Chester in northwest England, who took an army of 20,000 soldiers across to what we call today the island of Anglesey, but was known as the Isle of Mona, to suppress the Druids, who had sort of taken up the island as a bolt hole. And the story then goes that Paulinus maybe didn't quite finish the job because he was pulled back to southeast England, where Boadicea was causing trouble for the Romans. And there's a lot of suggestion that, Boadicea could be a druidess herself as well. So you get all of this stuff, but very little really factual to go on outside of a couple of accounts, only one of which is firsthand. And then for the next pretty much 1,500 years, there is very little. You really start to see Druidism picked up in medieval Irish literature, but even there it is a kind of conflating of Irish folk legends with a bit of Greek and Roman and a bit of early Christianity and a few pagan ideas as well. But when you get into the 17th, 18th, 19th century, there's sort of a Druid revival, as it were. And it starts with a chap called John Aubrey, who's an antiquarian, the author of a fantastically gossipy book called Brief Lives, which has been reprinted several times as a series of gossipy biographies of people like John Dee. But he also wrote a wonderful book called Miscellanies, this sort of Stuart ghost stories and supernatural accounts, which is well worth reading. But he investigated a lot of these monolithic structures around Britain and first suggested that Stonehenge was created by the Druids. And then in the 18th century, you get a clergyman, William Stukely, who did a major survey of Stonehenge and sort of confirmed this idea. So a lot of this is around Stonehenge. Another major influence on the sort of revival of Druidism is a chap called Edward Williams, or Iolo Morganwg, who was an antiquarian who went around Wales collecting Welsh texts and published them in the early 19th century. But we now know that he modified or added to or subtracted an awful lot from these texts. Now, arguably, you can be charitable and say he was part of a bardic tradition and felt it was his duty. But as historians, we would go, this is really not least because all we have of those texts is really his versions of them from the early 19th century. The original texts have long since gone. But then you're getting into the 19th century, the rise of nationalism. And what's fascinating, I think, is that the Druids start to become reappropriated around this kind of period of time, this 18th, 19th century, and absorbed into national stories. And you get different treatments. So, the French, the English, the Scottish, the Irish, the Welsh all have different interpretations of Druids that they absorb into their national story. And the most interesting there is probably the Welsh, where there is a fusion of Welsh identity, cultural heritage, and Welsh nationalism, which is reflected in characters like William Price. But, right towards the end of the 19th century, towards the time that Conan Doyle is writing, the Druids are then being reinterpreted again. So rather than being part of this national story, they're sort of being written out at this point in time, because you've got Darwinism, you have technological progress, you've got fears of degeneration, you've got fears of materiality, and the Victorians can no longer draw that straight line of progress from the past to the present, and things like the Druids start to take on a more unpleasant tone. We have to look at them not just as historical figures, but also as cultural figures, figures of cultural relevance as well.
I think that's particularly the case here with Price.
Yeah.
And his own individual appropriation.
Yes.
Of the Druidism, and I think we both use the phrase self-appointed or self-professed.
Yes.
He claimed he was the leader of the Druids in Wales, and this all, as you said, ties into his Welsh nationalist perspective as well. But at least you can say with Price he was a harmless figure.
Yes.
In that sense, he wasn't trying to whip up nationalist fervour. He was involved in the Chartist thing, but again, that's I think he himself probably regarded that as a kind of youthful indiscretion and a piece of folly that he didn't repeat. And then just followed his own path, which includes as well his rather odd appearance.
Yes.
And this was noted when he visited London. And at the time of the trial, the British Medical Journal picks up on this appearance of him and says, he dresses in a peculiar garb consisting of a white tunic and green trousers, and wears on his head a cap made of a fox's skin with the brush as a tassel. Some of our readers will probably remember him as having visited London about 12 years ago, when his green dress and fox skin cap rendered him a conspicuous object. So he wasn't frightened of being noticed.
No.
But again, a lot of this it's harmless eccentricity, that side to him. And it's also interesting that the time of the cremation, he was wearing a white robe.
He was, yeah.
So this back into what is regarded as kind of classic druidical garb, really. And this is what Conan Doyle again picks up on in the story, and Ap Griffith, the Druid in the Bloodstone tragedy, is in a dirty white robe.
Yes.
Which we'll come on to. There's a twist which explains what the dirty white robe is. But yes. It's again a beautiful play on these sort of stereotypes.
Yeah. And Ap Griffiths himself is this strange fusion of William Price and what Conan Doyle knows about Druidism, and some other sources as well. I mean, when he's introduced, he says, I am Ap Griffiths. I mean, he's actually Ap Griffiths, which should be Ap Griffith, which just shows that Conan Doyle has no real appreciation of Wales. And actually, a lot of this doesn't feel like Wales at all. But, I am Ap Griffiths of the pure blood of Arsdena, 17th in descent from the high priest Mona, who was second brother to the great queen Boadicea. Woman, I am the last of the Druids. And there you go. You've got a fusion there of Mona. He's got Mona confused because that's the name of Anglesey, is now a priest. You've got Boadicea being a druidess. That comes from some of Stukely's work, I think. And then Arsdena is potentially Andraste, which is the patron goddess of Boadicea. But the thing that's really interesting is that, you can feel other things at work here. And Theosophy comes to mind. This line, the bloodstone is dry, he cried. The bloodstone is dry. Shall it be said that in the days of the 15th Avatar, there was no man who would honour the old gods and no woman who would dare lie down upon the bloodstone? Well, all that Avatar stuff is kind of classic Madame Blavatsky Theosophy, where he's, and that fusion of Hinduism and other religious ideas and Christianity all into this melting pot, which becomes this slightly bizarre quasi-religion.
Which he'd again do later on with the Mystery of Klumba.
Yeah,
his story set in India and Afghanistan, where he again throws everything into the mix.
Yes,
there's little understanding or sophistication at this point. It's it's ideas that sound good and words that
Yes.
sound good, and it sounds convincing in this kind of fiction. It works at that level. As long as you don't investigate it too thoroughly, you just go with the flow.
Go with the flow, that's right.
Mm.
He would have been picking up on all of these ideas because 1884 is quite a pivotal year in terms of the sort of influences on him.
Yeah, this is it's an important part in his life. He's really beginning to settle into Portsmouth.
Mm,
And in late 1883, he joins the Portsmouth Literary and Scientific Society for social reasons, and also it will help his path. He's invited very quickly to become a lecturer with the society,
mm,
and he also through them becomes friendly with a gentleman we've mentioned before, General Alfred Drayson, retired,
yeah.
who is an astronomer, but he's also deeply interested in the occult and matters psychic.
Mm,
So Doyle is beginning to come in under his influence at this time and beginning to delve into these kind of mysteries,
yeah.
and that definitely finds your voice in this story.
Yeah. So Conan Doyle's armed with all the sort of accoutrements of theosophy, some shady knowledge of Druidism, some material from William Price, and starts to construct this character of Ap Griffiths. You also have his sacrificial altar, which borrows, I think, very heavily from Stonehenge, doesn't it? You've got
Mm,
the mark my stones, 34 without and 23 within, according to the direction of the learned and holy Mona,
mm,
which, is a direct lift, I think, of Stonehenge with its kind of inner and outer circle. And it's got a famous stone called the Slaughter
mm,
Stone, which is a big flat stone that's near the
mm,
perimeter and is meant to drip blood, but actually it's probably the iron content within it,
mm.
a bit of algae creating this effect.
And these are subjects will continue to interest him.
Mm,
This kind of mixing up of historical periods and in the vaguer pre-medieval world where everything gets again thrown into this melting pot. So we have the kind of the prehistoric stuff mixed up with this, and we'll get this later in The Hound of the Baskervilles,
yeah, yeah,
with the speculations about prehistoric necropolis and so on in
yes,
that, and also in another one of his ghost stories, The Brown Hand, which is
yes.
set near Stonehenge.
Mm,
So he is interested in this, and he's interested in a kind of as an amateur archaeologist, amateur historian level, but he's also hugely interested in it at a cultural level, and the
yes.
use that can be made of these locations within fiction to add atmosphere or to add an air of verisimilitude to certain narratives.
Yeah, and culturally, Druids have then been appropriated and used in all manner of different forms in literature and in pulp fiction, etc. I mean, they very quickly turn into pulp villains, probably on
Mm,
the back of all of this influence of Darwinism and degeneration and religious strife and things like that. I mean, it's interesting looking at who picks up and uses Druids in their work. Lovecraft has a few references to
mm,
Druids. Not that he makes, I think, a big point about
mm.
them, but you have people like Robert Bloch, who was a follower, I think, of
Yes.
Lovecraft, a
Yeah. Yeah.
protege,
Hmm.
and more famous now as the sort of writer of Psycho for
Mm.
Alfred Hitchcock. But he wrote a few stories like The Druidic Doom in 1936, which has a member of the gentry messing around with old Druid stones, or you have The Dark Isle. But the one I quite like is Power of the Druid from 1940, in which Nero faces off against Druids as well.
I mean, this also ties in with a kind of general interest in paganism
Yeah.
as well. Yeah, it doesn't have to be specifically Druidism, but there's this kind of paganism enters into fiction at this time in a big way, and people like Arthur Machen are
Mm.
very interested in this kind of the pre-Christian world, and how that can be reflected in the modern world. and he mixes paganism with science and pseudoscience.
Yes.
In stories like the great god Pan, and elements in the three imposters, those sort of stories. As you mentioned, Lovecraft, particularly in Rats in the Walls, is
Yes.
very interested in digging back into Lovecraft's version of British history.
Yes.
And you've also the Robert E. Howard,
Yeah.
and the Hyborian Age, and all these kind of sword and sorcery
Yes.
things, but more particularly with the Celtic side, you've got the kind of Bran MacMahon stories, and the tales, the little men and the Picts,
Yeah.
which Howard is particularly fascinated by. So you got that around the time of the Romans. Again, it's this kind of fantasized version of history,
Yeah.
but very interested in the Celtic world
Yes.
of that time, but again, very much seen through Howard's own eyes, and it all ties into. It's all part of the same cultural stream, and as you pointed out earlier with the Druids, it almost becomes a point where it doesn't matter about the historical
No,
Druids; it's what they turned into
that's right.
culturally,
That's right.
as you said, with the appearance, it's the white robes, the flowing beards. You can fit them into these scenarios with ease.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Even through to present day with Spinal Tap and Stonehenge,
Oh yes.
where the demons dwell and they do live well. There's also, I think you're right about the extending this to paganism. There's a really interesting thesis I read, which I'll put a link to in the show notes, which is Paganism in Late Victorian Literature. And the author Clementine Guillot has compared Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Macken's The Great God Pan, and actually M.R. James's Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. And essentially what it's saying is that, the late Victorian era, with this pressure of Darwinism and degeneration, is a kind of melting pot where people can start to explore these ideas, but contrasts Thomas Hardy's view of paganism in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is almost like a kind of responsible, I think, she phrased it, a responsible paganism, which is showing an alternative moral structure, which would be entirely in keeping with Thomas Hardy, who, of course, was not subscribing to late Victorian morality. But then you've also got Mac and James, who are looking more at the kind of horrific sides of it, the decadent, the mystical, the occult sides too. And I think in the case of James, the argument starts to weaken a bit because the stories that the author picks up on principally are Number 13 and Count Magnus, which are a specific subset, I think, of James's writing. But you can see it's all in here. This idea of using paganism as a way to raise questions about where people sit in this changing age and feelings of powerlessness, and then some authors taking it as being an alternative way forward, others seeing it as being another way of reflecting the kind of horrors or the powerlessness of the time, I think.
And it's I mean, we mentioned James. It's a lot of his character with Count Magnus, and then you'd later have Carswell in Casting the Runes, more satanic characters.
Yes.
I mean, if anybody in his is a pagan, it's Mr. Abney.
Yes,
In Lost Hearts.
Yeah, that's right.
And that again has that's one of his stories that does tap into this sort of cultural stream more than any other.
Yeah.
But it's done in a very sophisticated manner with James. If you compare, say, Lost Hearts with the Bloodstone tragedy, they're worlds apart with the way they're approaching this subject. With the Bloodstone tragedy, it is I'm afraid we've got a stage villain almost,
completely.
and we find out almost literally.
Yes, we do, and he gets a very sort of stage villain exit as well, in the sense that as Miss Madison is rescued, he receives a bonk on the head, which results in a sudden change of character.
Yeah, so we find out at the end of the story. So what became of him? And it's basically the husband, or the future husband of Miss Madison, has bashed him on the head with a big stick or something, and it revealed who he truly was, and he turns out he's actually a very well-known man of science and an archaeologist who'd lost his reason, and had actually been incarcerated in a local asylum and escaped. It's great stuff. I mean, it
Well,
again fits so much into this sort of fiction where it's too much learning has driven him mad, essentially, and all he needed was a good crack on
on the
the
head.
skull, and it brings him back to sanity. So he gets the description of Ap Griffiths when Miss Madison first sees him. He was an elderly man with long floating hair and a grizzled beard, which descended over his breast. His dress was a sort of ragged gown, which had been originally white, but was now weather-stained and dirty.
Yes.
And as Owen Dudley Edwards points out, this is quite evidently a medical gown,
Yes.
which the doctor he's filched as he's escaped
As he's
the
escaped.
asylum.
That's right.
So,
I do love the whole idea, though, that he's bonked on the head and changes character, because that is exactly what happens with King Tut in Batman, in Adam West's Batman, a mild-mannered historian by day, bonked on the head because a lunatic at night. Oh dear.
yeah. So what we find out, and after we'll have to call him Ap Griffiths because we never get his real name.
No, we don't.
So after he's taken the crack on the skull, he's back to normality, well, of a kind. But what this does again, it's again, if Doyle had more time with the story, we've already talked about the kind of nested narratives. So here again, we've got another deception going on, in that the Druid is not what he seems to be either.
Yes, that's
So
right.
it's deception after deception, possibly, with this story. So that is something else that Doyle could have played with here.
And I think he did play with it, in the sense that the thing that really struck me reading this again was the connection between this and the Surgeon of Gasterfell, which might not immediately seem apparent, but you have in Miss Madison a headstrong young woman who breaks from the party and goes into the woods in exactly the same way as Eva Cameron does in The Surgeon of Gasterfell. She is then essentially encounters a mad figure, but the same descriptions of the setting, the descriptions of the hills. This doesn't feel like Wales to me. It feels to me much more like the area around Masongill. And so you get, I think whether Conan Doyle did it deliberately or unconsciously, I feel he comes back to potentially the same source material that inspired Bloodstone Tragedy is inspiring Surgeon of Gasterfell, because there are too many similarities, too many commonalities for it to be, I think, by accident.
Yeah, it's as you said, the similarity of the theme you got is kind of the lunatic let loose in the wilds element to it. And also, I don't know. It might be reading too much in, but the kind of, even though there's the ludicrous aspect of the crack on the skull, and he becomes himself again. And is this Doyle kind of wishing this would happen?
Well,
not the crack on
maybe.
the skull, but but that his father might be brought back.
Yeah.
From if only it were like that in real life, kind of thing, that you could just snap your fingers, essentially.
Yeah.
And sanity is restored. There is, I think, that sort of element is going on in this story as well. And in a way, oddly enough, it's almost what happened with Price.
Yes.
Is
That's
that
true.
at the end of it, he's acquitted of these charges. He actually then does cremate his son, with a huge crowd of approving people watching.
Yes. Yeah.
And we then get the law slowly changes, or it becomes more specific about the allowing of cremation and the cultural acceptance of cremation. So from this mad story of William Price comes a sane conclusion.
Yeah, that's a nice point. That's a nice
Mm,
way of rounding it out, I think.
mm, mm.
So I think we can fairly say it's not a great example of Conan Doyle's work. It definitely feels like it was rushed off quickly to capitalize on a moment. But I wonder if, that is the full story behind why this story has not really been remembered.
Yeah, it's one that where we know from the original letter which revealed the existence of this story as one of Conan Doyle's. In the original letter to Castles, Doyle says, "Dear Sir, I am at present republishing a volume of my stories. I should like very much to add to them John Barrington Cowell's and The Bloodstone, both of which appeared in the Saturday Journal," which means, the time he writes the letter, it's not a story he wants to suppress.
No,
It's not a story he regards with embarrassment.
no.
And he did want to put it in between hardcovers as part of his very first collection, which, as we know, didn't happen. But that's the last mention of it
Yeah.
that we know. It then does disappear into obscurity. Again, Owen Dudley Edwards speculates that perhaps there was worry that Price had legal grounds
Yes.
to actually sue for libel with
Mm.
this story,
Mm.
even though he is mentioned, and he is differentiated from Ap Griffiths by the fact that he's mentioned himself by name
Yes.
at the
Yeah.
beginning of the story. But Owen speculates that the Castles would have been worried about this and realised they were lucky to have got away with it in the first
Yeah,
place, perhaps.
maybe.
And there is a great difference between publishing a story anonymously in a kind of throwaway journal
Yeah.
to then having the story published under the author's name between hardcovers.
Yes.
So that may have played a part, or it could be the fact that Doyle then goes back to it when he's putting together the Captain the Pole Star, and then realizing, this is Prentice work,
Yeah.
and hackneyed stuff at that, and perhaps I shouldn't perpetuate this story,
Yeah.
and that sort of attitude. So
Yeah.
whatever the real reason, it was forgotten, and were it not for Mike Aylward, buying this letter, and actually doing the detective work, it would still be a forgotten story.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. You can read the show notes at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice. And consider sponsoring us as a patron, either via PayPal or at patreon.com/doingsofdoyle. So, Paul, what are we looking at next month?
Well, throughout this episode, we've made various mentions of the story John Barrington Cowell's, which almost becomes a companion piece to the Bloodstone tragedy. So we'll actually explore that tale of psychic vampirism in next month's podcast.
Brilliant. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Call me a madman, does he?
Well, let's face it, Tut-Tut.
Face what, sweet, lovely Nefertiti?
In the old days, when you were professor at Yale, before you got conked on the head in that student riot...
Nefertiti, we could have you filleted for that.
Oh, I can't do this. I can't pivot off something as stupid as that onto Charles Doyle.